We tell you now of a woman who, at 41 years old, stood at the edge of a life with nothing left to lose. Her husband was dead, her home had been taken from beneath her by the very family she had trusted, and the only kin she had left had turned his back on her with a signature and a lie. She counted $11 into her palm, the whole of what remained to her name, and with it she did something the town of Larkspur Hollow would call foolish, then scandalous, then, in time, something else entirely. She spent 6 of those dollars on a rusted iron door bored into the side of a dead mountain, the old Larkspur mine entrance, boarded shut for 28 years. Sold at auction because no one else would touch it. They laughed as she signed the paper. They laughed harder when she carried her lantern up the switchback trail alone. But sealed in the dark behind that door was something that would not just change the shape of her own life, it would settle a debt owed to an entire town. A debt some had spent a generation trying to bury. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Whitfield. If you are watching this from a town that people forgot, or a corner of your own life that feels boarded shut and worthless, tell us in the comments. We would love to hear where you are joining us from tonight. Della Bell had been raised on the understanding that worth was not always visible to the eye that looked for it quickly. Her father, Thomas Bell, had spent 11 years of his life beneath the earth of the very mountain that would one day matter so much to her. Working the deep galleries of the Larkspur silver mine alongside 40 other men who trusted the timber over their heads and the promises made to their families. Thomas was not a man of many words, but he had one saying he repeated so often that it became a kind of him in their small cabin at the edge of Larkspur Hollow. The ground gives up nothing to a hand that will not dig. He meant it about silver, but he meant it about everything, about patience, about faith, about people who seemed used up and empty at first glance. Della's mother, Ruth, had died bringing her into the world, and so it was Thomas who raised her, who taught her to read by lamplight from a single water-stained Bible and a stack of borrowed almanacs. Who taught her how to keep ledgers for the company store because he believed a woman who could account for every penny owed to her would never again be cheated by a man with a smooth tongue and a quick pen. It was a strange gift to give a daughter in 1858, but Thomas Bell was not a conventional man, and Della grew into a woman who could read a contract 3 times before she signed it and who noticed always the places where numbers did not quite agree with themselves. She was 9 years old when the collapse came. The men of Larkspur Hollow still called it the Long Dark, the day in the autumn of 1861 when a section of the lower gallery gave way without warning, burying 6 men including her father beneath tons of rock and timber that no rescue party could move in time. Della remembered the sound the whole town made that night, a low collective moan that seemed to come from the mountain itself rather than from any human throat. She remembered, too, the promise that Elias Cobb, the mine's owner, made at her father's graveside and at the gravesides of the 5 other men, that the families of the dead would receive a share of the mine's future profits in perpetuity. A covenant written up by the company's own lawyer and read aloud to the widows and orphans gathered in the frost. Cobb had wept when he said it. Della, young as she was, believed him completely, because grief, she would learn much later, is one of the most convincing masks a dishonest man can wear. The mine never opened again in Della's memory. Cobb declared, within the year, that the vein had run dry, that the Long Dark had taken not just 6 lives but the last of the profitable ore. And that the promised shares would therefore amount to nothing, since there would be no profits from which to draw them. He sealed the entrance with an iron door and left Larkspur Hollow for the railroad towns to the east, and the widows of the Long Dark learned to live without him, without the mine, and largely without hope of restitution. Ruth's sister took Della in for a time, and later she was raised partly by the kindness of neighbors, women who taught her to sew and to bake and, more valuably, taught her the particular frontier art of making something whole out of what other people threw away, a torn dress reborn as a quilt square, a cracked churn mended with tin and patience, a broken family stitched back together by shared suppers and shared grief. By the time she was 17, Della Bell was known throughout the hollow as a woman with careful hands and a careful mind, someone who could look at a ruined thing and see, underneath the ruin, what it had once been and what it might become again. She married Amos Whitfield when she was 22, a quiet, decent man who farmed 60 acres at the northern edge of the valley and who loved her, she always said. The way a man loves rain after a long drought, with a kind of grateful astonishment that never quite wore off. They had 18 years together, no children that lived past infancy. 2 small graves on the hill behind their cabin that Della visited every Sunday with wildflowers in her fist regardless of the season. Amos was not a rich man, but he was a careful one, and the farm prospered modestly under their joined labor, enough to keep them fed and warm and, in good years, enough to help a neighbor through a hard winter. Della kept the farm's accounts herself, in the same neat, precise hand her father had taught her. And it was this habit, this insistence on knowing exactly what was owed and what was not, that would matter more than she could have imagined when everything else was taken from her. The fall came swiftly, the way falls often do, disguised at first as ordinary bad luck. Amos died in the spring of 1887, thrown from a spooked horse while clearing a fence line, dead before Della could reach him across the near pasture. She was 39 years old and, for the second time in her life, watching a beloved man buried in the frost-hard ground of a valley that had already taken so much from her. What she did not know, in those first raw weeks of mourning, was that Amos's younger brother, Silas Whitfield, had been quietly cultivating a debt against the farm for nearly 2 years, a private loan, he claimed, made to Amos to cover a bad season. Secured by a note bearing what appeared to be Amos's signature. Della had never seen this note in her husband's lifetime, had never heard him speak of any debt to his brother, and something in her, some instinct sharpened by a father who taught her to distrust smooth paper, told her the signature was wrong even before a lawyer confirmed the forgery years too late to matter. But Silas had timed his claim well, filing it with the county in the disorienting fog of her grief, and by the time Della had gathered herself enough to fight it, the local judge, an old friend of Silas's from his cattle trading days, had already ruled the debt valid and the farm forfeit. She fought him as hard as a woman with no money and no living witnesses could fight, but the law in that country in those years was not built to hear a widow's word against a man's forged signature. And in the autumn of 1888, 18 months after Amos's death, Della Whitfield walked off the 60 acres she had helped build with her own 2 hands, carrying 1 trunk of clothing, her father's old Bible, her mother's cracked wedding ring, and $11 that she had managed to hide from Silas inside the lining of her second-best coat. Silas did not even have the grace to avoid her eye when she left. He stood on the porch of what had been her home and watched her go, and something in his expression, not triumph exactly, but a kind of practiced blankness, told her that this had never been about a debt at all. It had been about land, and about the fact that a widow alone was easier to rob than a woman with a husband standing beside her. She took a room above the mercantile in Larkspur Hollow for 2 nights, paying with coins she could not spare. Trying to think through what a woman with $11 and no property and no family willing to shelter her might possibly do next. It was on the second of those nights that she heard, through the thin floorboards, 2 men from the county office discussing an auction to be held that Saturday, old Cobb holdings, abandoned decades ago, being sold off finally to settle unpaid taxes accumulated since Elias Cobb had died childless and forgotten in a railroad town somewhere in Nebraska. Among the parcels listed, almost as an afterthought, almost as a joke, the sealed entrance to the old Larkspur silver mine and the half-acre of scrub land surrounding it, minimum bid, $5. Della lay awake a long while that night, listening to the wind work at the shutters, thinking of her father saying the ground gives up nothing to a hand that will not dig. Thinking of the 6 men buried under that mountain and the promise made and broken over their graves. Thinking that she had exactly enough money to buy the 1 piece of ground in the entire county that everyone else considered worthless. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself a woman alone with no capital and no crew and no earthly reason to believe there was anything left inside that mountain was a woman about to throw away the last of what she had. And then she thought of the ledgers her father had taught her to read, of numbers that did not agree with themselves. And something quiet and stubborn in her decided that she would rather own a door to nothing than own nothing at all. The auction was held on the courthouse steps in a thin, cold rain, and when the auctioneer called the Larkspur mine parcel, there was a ripple of laughter among the dozen or so men gathered there. The kind of laughter men give to something they've already decided isn't worth their attention. No one bid against her. She paid her $6, one more than the minimum, because she would not risk losing even this to a latecomer's whim, and walked away with a folded deed and the frank open pity of everyone who had watched her do it. Randall Cobb, Elias's son, home briefly from the bank he now ran 2 towns over, happened to be standing near the courthouse steps that morning, and Della would remember, later, the peculiar sharpness with which he watched her fold that deed into her coat, a sharpness that did not match the mild, amused smile he wore for the benefit of the crowd. She walked the 2 miles up the switchback trail to the mine entrance that same afternoon, carrying a crowbar borrowed from the mercantile owner, who had lent it to her more out of curiosity than confidence. The iron door had rusted nearly solid into its frame, and it took her the better part of an hour, working alone in the thin autumn light, to pry it loose enough to swing outward with a groan that seemed to come from the mountain's own chest. The air that breathed out of the darkness was cool and mineral and strangely dry, not the collapsed, poisoned air she had half expected, and when she lit her lantern and stepped across the threshold, the first thing she found was not silver and not danger but a small wooden crate, deliberately placed just inside the entrance, as though someone had wanted it to be the very first thing any future visitor would see. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, was a leather-bound ledger, and tucked inside its front cover, a single folded letter addressed, in a careful clerk's hand, to whoever finds this. Della sat down on the cold stone floor of that entrance tunnel with her lantern beside her and read the letter twice through before she could make herself believe it. It was written by a man named Ambrose Keene, foreman of the Larkspur mine at the time of the Long Dark, and dated only 3 weeks before the collapse that had killed her father. In it, Keene described what none of the widows had ever been told, that in the final months before the accident, the crew had struck a new vein far richer than anything the mine had previously produced, a discovery Keene himself had surveyed and recorded in careful detail in the very ledger Della now held. Elias Cobb, Keene wrote, had sworn the surveying crew to silence, intending to quietly buy out or intimidate the smaller claim holders in the valley before the news could spread and drive prices up. And it was in the course of rushing new shoring timbers into place to open a faster route to this vein, timbers installed in haste, against Keene's own written objections, which he had preserved in these very pages, that the lower gallery had given way and killed 6 men, Thomas Bell among them. Cobb had then sealed the mine and claimed the vein exhausted specifically so that he would never have to honor the profit-sharing covenant he had made over the widows' graves. A promise Keene's ledger showed, in Cobb's own annotated hand, that Cobb had never intended to keep even at the moment he was making it. Keene, sick with guilt and unable to prove his employer's fraud without ending his own livelihood and likely his life, had hidden the ledger and this confession in the one place he was certain Cobb would never look again, inside the very mine Cobb wanted the world to forget. Della read the letter a 3rd time by the last of the daylight coming through the open door, her hands shaking not with fear but with something closer to fury held very still. The particular fury of a woman who has just learned that her father did not simply die in an accident of chance but in an accident of greed, sealed shut by a lie told over his own grave. She thought of Silas Whitfield's practiced blankness on the porch of her stolen farm. And she thought that perhaps forged signatures and broken promises ran in certain kinds of men the way red hair or a crooked nose ran in certain families, passed down not by blood but by example. She did not sleep that night, sitting up in her rented room with Ambrose Keene's ledger open across her knees, working through his surveyor's notations with the same patient, exact attention her father had taught her to bring to any set of figures. What she found, as the candle burned low, both frightened and steadied her. Keene's ledger did not merely describe a vein of silver, it mapped it, with a precision that a trained mining engineer would recognize instantly, showing a deposit running deeper into the mountain than the section that had collapsed, entirely untouched by the disaster that had sealed the shaft above it. If Keene's survey could be trusted, and every other page of his meticulous record suggested it could, there was still ore in that mountain, valuable ore. sitting undisturbed for 28 years precisely because everyone in the valley, including its own rightful heirs, had been told there was nothing left worth finding. But it was the last page of the ledger that mattered most to her, more than any survey of silver. Keene had copied out, in full, the original profit-sharing covenant that Cobb had drafted and signed at the graveside. The same document the widows had been shown once and then never allowed to keep a copy of, the same document Cobb had later claimed no longer applied because there were no profits to share. Keene had preserved it word for word, along with a note in his own hand affirming that he had witnessed Cobb's signature and that the covenant, so far as Keene understood the law, remained binding on Cobb's heirs and assigns for as long as the mine produced or of value, a mine that Della Whitfield now legally owned. She understood, sitting there with the candle guttering, that she was holding two kinds of wealth at once, and that the second was more dangerous to hold than the first. A rich vein of silver, if it could be safely and legally extracted, would restore her own fortune many times over. But the covenant, if it could be enforced, meant that the descendants of all 6 men who died in the long dark, families still living in Larkspur Hollow in reduced circumstances, families who had spent 28 years believing the mine had truly failed, were owed a debt that predated her own claim to the property and that, morally if not yet legally, outranked it. Her father had died believing his daughter would never see the value the mountain owed her. She intended to see that his death, and the deaths of the 5 men beside him, would finally mean something. Word of what Della had found could not stay quiet for long in a town as small as Larkspur Hollow, especially once she began, cautiously, to hire 2 trustworthy men to help her assess whether the lower gallery could be safely reopened without risking another collapse. Randall Cobb arrived from his bank 2 towns over within the week, no longer wearing his mild, amused courthouse smile. He came to her rented room above the mercantile with a lawyer at his side and a claim of his own, that any minerals discovered on the property rightfully belonged to the Cobb estate under a reservation clause he insisted, without producing any document to prove it, had been included in the original county tax sale. Della listened to him with the same still patience she had learned from a father who taught her to read every contract 3 times, and when he finished, she asked him, quite calmly, to produce the reservation clause in writing. He could not. She then asked him whether he was familiar with a man named Ambrose Keene, and watched something flicker behind Randall Cobb's eyes that told her more clearly than any ledger could that he already knew, or had long suspected, exactly what his father had done to 6 dead men and the town that trusted him. Randall did not give up easily. He returned to the county recorder's office and attempted to have Della's deed voided on a technicality regarding the original tax auction's posting. A maneuver that cost her 3 anxious weeks and the last of her $11 in filing fees she could barely afford. Weeks during which she took in mending and washing for the mercantile owner's family simply to keep herself fed while the matter was resolved. He spread word through the valley, subtly and through others rather than directly, that the widow Whitfield had gone strange with grief and was chasing ghosts up an empty mountain, hoping to shame her into abandoning her claim before she could organize any real support. Some in Larkspur Hollow believed him. Grief does strange things to reputations as easily as it does to hearts, and there were those who had already written Della off as a woman undone by her losses. But there were others, among them Sarah Keene, Ambrose Keene's own granddaughter, still living quietly in the valley and unaware until Della sought her out that her grandfather's long-ago disappearance from mine records had ever meant anything more than an old man simply moving on. Who began, slowly, to stand beside her once they understood what the ledger actually proved. The county judge who finally heard the matter, a newer man than the one who had ruled against Della's farm and considerably less indebted to Randall Cobb's family, examined Keene's ledger and the copied covenant with the care of someone who understood that a mountain's worth of silver was, in this case, a secondary matter to a plainer question of honesty. Della had, by then, arranged for an independent mining engineer from the territorial capital to confirm both the safety of reopening the upper section of the lower gallery and the presence of the vein Keene had surveyed. Evidence that made Randall's claim of a hidden reservation clause look increasingly like the invention it was. When the judge ruled, at last, that Della Whitfield's deed was valid, that the profit-sharing covenant witnessed by Ambrose Keene remained legally binding upon Cobb's heirs. And that Randall Cobb's family therefore owed a debt of shared profit stretching back nearly 3 decades. The courtroom in the county seat went very quiet. The particular quiet of a small community realizing that a truth it had lived beside without seeing had just been dragged into the light. Della did not take the silver for herself alone, though every dollar of it was legally hers to claim outright as the mine's new owner. She sat down instead with Sarah Keene and with the surviving children and grandchildren of the other 5 men lost in the long dark. Spreading Ambrose Keene's ledger across a borrowed table in the church hall, and she told them what her father had always taught her, that the ground gives up nothing to a hand that will not dig. But that what it gives, once dug for honestly, ought to be shared fairly among all the hands that helped uncover it. She organized the reopened mine not as her private property alone but as a cooperative venture. Honoring the original covenant by allotting a formal share of all future profits to each of the 6 families the long dark had orphaned, herself among them. With the rest set aside to fund a proper school for the valley's children, a school Larkspur Hollow had never been able to afford. And a small fund to maintain the graves on the hill where her father and his 5 companions had rested, unhonored, for 28 years. Randall Cobb, facing both the court's ruling and the plain contempt of a town that finally understood what his father had done, did not go to prison. There was no law in that country for what old Elias Cobb had done, only shame, and shame, as it turned out, was a heavier debt than Randall had ever expected to pay. He sold his interest in the bank 2 towns over and left the valley within the year, and the last anyone in Larkspur Hollow heard of him. He was working as a clerk in a railroad office far to the east, keeping other men's books instead of building on his father's lies. Some called it justice. Della called it, more simply, the mountain finally giving up what had always belonged to someone else. We began this story by telling you that Della Whitfield, at 41 years old, had nothing left but $11 and a coat with a torn lining. Cast out by a man who mistook her grief for weakness and her patience for surrender. We told you she spent 6 of those dollars on a door that everyone else believed led to nothing at all. What we did not tell you, not yet, was that the value hidden behind that door was never only silver, it was a truth 6 families had been denied for a generation. A truth that only a woman raised to read numbers carefully and to see worth where others saw ruin could have uncovered and, more importantly, could have known what to do with once she found it. Della never forgot the sound the whole valley made the night of the long dark, and she never forgot her father's voice telling her that the ground gives up nothing to a hand that will not dig. She dug, alone, with a borrowed crowbar and a coat full of her last dollars. And what she brought up into the light was not merely enough to rebuild her own life but enough to finally make Larkspur Hollow whole. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Della Whitfield's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than the world has bothered to notice. We would love to know, in the comments below, about a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off, whether it was an old object, a forgotten place, or perhaps even yourself in a season when you felt cast aside. Until next time, stay close.